Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Almushaikeh. I'm a PhD student in applied physics and a board member at Student for Sustainability. It's a pleasure to welcome you to today's seminar. So this seminar series started in March 2020 through a great collaboration with the Office of Sustainability. Our goal is to create a platform for sharing, learning, and raising awareness about critical sustainability topics. Over the years, we have had the privilege of hearing from distinguished speakers from across the world, learning about their expertise and passion to creating a greener and more sustainable future for all. Today, we are honored to host one of our own here at KAUST, Dr. Ian Campbell. Dr. Ian is the Senior Vice President of NTI, where he leads several large-scale strategic projects, including the KAUST Coral Restoration Initiative, the Beacon Development Consultancy, and the newly established Translation Hub. He also oversees the International Hubs Initiative, building a global network to expand KAUST reach and foster international collaboration. Before joining KAUST, Dr. Ian served as Executive Chair of Innovate UK, where he led health and life sciences strategy and helped secure major COVID-19 funds for UK businesses. He is also an experienced entrepreneur and a former CEO in the healthcare sector, and was appointed Officer of the Order of the British Empire for his contributions to innovation. Thank you so much, Professor Ian, for accepting our invitation. Please help me welcome Dr. Ian.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? So when you get introduced, you always feel old, and then you don't recognize yourself. And then it doesn't help when you hear what you're supposed to be responsible for and what you're not. That being said, the work that I'll cover today has largely been done by everybody else. I've made a career out of talking about things that other people do, and we'll try and spend about 45 minutes talking about it. Sustainability and technologies are intrinsically linked together. And my first experience of trying to do that at scale was actually during COVID, that was mentioned in the introduction, when I think we ran one of the world's first sustainable innovation programs. And at that time, we didn't want to make everything zero carbon, but we wanted to capture what businesses were doing by way of their daily activities. So if you applied to get funding, you had to commit to what your footprint was, with the aspiration that whatever you were developing was either going to impact it or you were going to run your business differently through doing it. And so sustainability, I think, is paramount. And in innovation and technologies and partnerships, if we're not looking at least to the perception of sustainability and what we can do to drive different behaviors and different outcomes, then I don't think the businesses or the innovations will survive or indeed be adopted commercially. So I think sustainability has to be at everything that we do. With regards to the NTI, you heard from the introduction, we cover a broad remit. What we're really trying to do is engage in creating a partnership-based endeavor that makes the walls of KAUST semi-permeable. In other words, it lets good ideas come in and we allow good ideas to go out. We can't do that on our own, so we seek partnerships at scale, and then we divide it into some of the grand challenges that we face. And over the next few minutes, I'll try and go through some examples of what we're trying to do and how that might work together. Please feel free to interrupt me, either ask a question online if you're online, or raise your hands. I'm happy to stop at any time. However, that being said, NTI was created in August of 2023, and at that time, I wrote down in my brain what I thought NTI should look like, and that's the diagram that's on the screen. And basically, everything that we're doing is covered by the 4 pillars: economies of the future, health and wellness, energy and industrial leadership, and sustainability, sustainable environment, and supply of essential needs. Now, I would say 2 of those 4 should cover everything. I think economies of the future and sustainable environment should be captured by everything that we do. And then if we go one layer down, what are we trying to do? We're trying to scale initiatives to make an impact, whether that's creating a company and allowing it to grow, or working with a ministry to create a test bed, or to indeed use some of our environmental consultancy services to inform what the best routes are forward. So we try to scale an NPP as national priority projects, and we'll talk about them a little bit later. But in order to do that, we need to create ventures and we need to incubate ideas. But we do that in partnerships with the universities, with technologies, and with clients and partners, with the aim of creating impact. And I know the center of the circle says revenue, but revenue is a measure. Societal impact would be a measure. Creating jobs would be a measure. Delivering value would be a measure. So we just try to make sure that whatever we do has a purpose at the end of it. If it's basic research, that belongs in the labs. That's not an NTI. If it's a mission-driven or a project with a milestones, that becomes more into NTI space. So our scope is really to work with academia, with industry, and with government to drive change, adoption, investment, collaboration, and overall to create impact. And we know the KAUST strategy is about accelerating impact, but I think we've got to create it and accelerate it. The most important part of this slide is the two directional arrows, because we've got to have a flow of ideas in and out. We've got to have exchange of knowledge. We've got to have interactions with business and academia and government. And we've got to look to do that at scale. And we can use KAUST assets, our faculty, our infrastructure, and our resources to try and create impact scale. So within the innovation ecosystem, which is led by Haitham Al-Humzi, there's really four key value things that we can do. We can create new ventures. We can use entrepreneurism as a means of creating capacity. We can provide funding, and we can provide access to facilities and incubation. Most people think the important thing here is the access to funding. I actually think the most important ingredient here is capacity building. Because if we don't nurture great ideas and have great people, then we won't translate good ideas into great outcomes. And we can have great ideas trying to be driven by average people, and we'll get poor outcomes. So to me, it's all about creating capacity. We talk a lot about impact, and I thought it was important to reflect on the 10 years or so that the innovation ecosystem has been around at KAUST. So, and I think some of the numbers might stagger some of the people in KAUST itself when you see it written down. We have created or supported 375 companies. They have gone on to raise almost $650 million in investment and almost $430 million in revenue. There are 168 active startups that we've worked with that are still going. And I think the number is now roughly 6,600 jobs have been created. This slide's slightly out of date. And the portfolio valuation is about $2 billion. So when we talk about innovation, the university might not directly benefit from this activity. But if we say the average salary of somebody's $50,000, KAUST is contributing $30 million to the Saudi economy every year because of the 6,000 or so people that are employed or engaged through these activities. By the same token, of the 374 that we've started, only 168 survive. So I'll tell you a little story about that. When I was the head of Innovate, we used to give out public funding. And every year I had to go to the Treasury and I had to justify how we'd spent our money. And what I used to sit in the Treasury and say is, well, over 5 years, I can tell you that 90% of the companies that were funded are still surviving. They're paying taxes, so you should be really pleased. Then I would walk down Whitehall to another office in Victoria Street to the Business, Energy, and Industrial Strategy Unit and say, well, I've invested all this money. 90% of the companies are surviving. It's really bad because we're not taking enough risk because more companies should fail. Because the more failures and learning that you have, the better the companies, the better the entrepreneurs for the experience of doing it. So there's got to be an acceptance when you're an innovation or an NTI. At least the majority of things will fail. You're looking for things that can scale and be successful. And therefore, what you don't want to do is enable average ideas to without reaching any impact. So I would rather have one success, big success, and 9 failures than 9 things going along and 1 failing, because that tells me we don't have the risk profile right. But today's topic is about sustainability. So in our portfolio, we have a number of companies that are directly looking at the sustainable environment. And some of the companies I think you'll recognize here have been around for a while. Almushaikeh with their cleaning solutions, not just for airplanes anymore, but they do domestic cleaning as well, and they've broadened their activities. Some of them have test facilities in KAUST, such as Edama, with the taking of your food waste and then converting it into fertilizers, into soil that can then be used to replant. And then we've got ones that you might not recognize. So the one I like is Baraka. So Baraka is an online food provider that takes essentially out-of-date food and redistributes it. So we are preventing waste. So this is a bit like the Hippocratic Oath. If you can't do any good, then do minimal harm. So therefore, they've taken a whole idea of taking all the food at the end of the day and redistributing it to people that can afford to buy it and creating a company out of it. So you can see that we span the remit of various different technologies in various different areas. One that you might not have heard of is New Rain. That's a spin out from Professor Sakali's lab, where they're scaling up the use of wastewater to reuse it for non-potable applications. And hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll announce an acceleration of that project in the coming weeks. But one of the advantages that we have here at KAUST is actually the environment we operate in. So I can't think of a university where we can test autonomous cars in the safe environment as we have here. If you think the traffic is bad here, I suggest you go and try and commute in London. Then you'll realize that we're on a good thing. So it takes 2 iTunes songs for me to get to work at the moment, as opposed to 2.5 hours in the train. With that comes real advantage. We can test things at a city scale in a controlled environment that allow us to understand how things operate. So the autonomous car, which is going to be back on the roads shortly if it's not there already, is able to meet junctions, deal with pedestrians, have dual carriageways, increase its speed, go into residential areas and into industrial areas. So it's a perfect test bed for autonomous vehicles. With the algae plant, you might not have noticed, we have a lot of sunlight. We get plenty of seawater. So the scientists in the lab developed a strain of algae called spirulina that is salt tolerant. So with sunlight and seawater and a paddle that goes round, we can create mass of algae. When you dry that down, that becomes protein. That protein can be made for both livestock feed and fish feed. The kingdom imports roughly $1 billion of fish feed every year. So therefore, we can make a sustainable product for a domestic supply, reduce imports, reduce the carbon footprint, and use the environment to produce a product that's of value. Now, the reality is, in order to do that, we need to make the protein at $2 per kilogram. So it's a commodity product. But using similar strains of algae, you can create perfumes, fragrances, cosmetics, nutraceuticals, and pharmaceuticals, all of which have higher value. So if we can test it at that scale for commodity products, we can then build more value into it. And at the same time, recruit, train, and inspire new algae technologists into the field. And then that technology can then be deployed throughout the kingdom. And so once again, we're trying to reach outside the walls of KAUST, but using KAUST as a test bed to do it. As I said, impact comes in many shapes and forms, economic and societal. And what we've got in the slide is the range of high-level projects that are currently within NTI. So for those of you that don't know, the reason why I came to KAUST was to begin the project, which is now the Coral Restoration Initiative. Just to clarify, I knew nothing about corals, still don't know very much. All I knew was that I could run big projects, and that in order to run big projects, you required a team that needed to break the project down into smaller projects. So we'll talk a little bit about the aims of the project in a minute or two. The algae and aquaculture is really mission-driven through MIWA, that's the Ministry for Environment, Water and Agriculture, aimed at increasing the nutritional content of food, and creating an industry in agri-food that can be supported for the longer term. In other words, creating national sovereignty or national security around food and supply chains. Another project that we're working on right now, and you may have seen a bit of activity around the building over recent weeks, is we're trying to build the Saudi Centre for Protein and Vaccine Therapeutics. This, again, is about creating domestic supply, but it's also about creating an environment where ideas can go from the university, be scaled into clinical trials, and then can hopefully become products that are then landed in the kingdom. At the same time, we don't have any GMP manufacturing capabilities in the kingdom. So alongside the therapeutic centre will be a training centre that will be located on Building 2, and that's there to create GMP-ready workforce. Now, that meets the university's mission of education and training, and it also means that we can bring outsiders into KAUST, accredit them from different parts of biomanufacturing, and then allow them to get jobs as the sector grows in line with the national biotech strategy. The Future Mobility Sandbox we'll come back to a bit later, as we will with Climate-Crete and cryogenic carbon capture. But the Coral Restoration Project. So if somebody was to say, what are we trying to achieve? The answer is simple. We gave a mission that by 2040, we would restore the coral reefs around Shusha Island to be pristine. They're not pristine today, but they're not bad. But what we're aiming to do is to take technologies that have been created in Seymour and elsewhere and scale them to take something that is a cottage industry today and to make it like a high throughput factory. So we're going from producing maybe a few hundred corals in a quarter to 400,000 corals in a year. And we aim to deploy roughly 1.7 million corals across 100 hectares by 2030. And the reason why we say we want a thriving reefscape by 2040 is it's going to take 10 years for those corals to settle and become part of the natural ecosystem. Why should a university do this? So the answer, I think, is quite simple. One is to take all the technologies that we need to allow us to develop it. Second is to allow us to measure the impact that we have. Thirdly, if 90% of coral reefs are going to die by 2050, then what we must do is trying to learn which technologies can scale to be solutions that are going to prevent that from becoming a reality. So let's talk a little bit about the technologies. So we're going to create a digital twin. Are we doing that because it's nice and everybody's doing digital twins? No. We are mapping out the 100 hectares. We are looking at which corals are there today. We're looking for areas where we can deploy corals. And then we're trying to sense which areas would be best for restoration. And then for each 25 meter grid within the 100 hectares, we're going to create a work plan. Then we're going to take corals and we're going to put them down, but we're going to have them tagged. And then every so often, we're going to send vehicles over it to image them that will then send back, are they growing? So in real time, we can assess what's the impact of our work. Are we getting new species of wildlife there? Are we bringing predators into the area? Are we disrupting the natural coral? Is the sea temperature increasing? Are our corals resilient? Are they growing? Is the temperature of the seawater still rising? We can do that by creating sensors around it and consistently monitoring it. We're creating effectively a factory to grow 400,000 fragments of coral. Why? We're taking something that's done predominantly in the sea today, highly manual, highly labor intensive, using ropes to tie corals onto and waiting months for them to grow. And once they've grown, they're then redeployed. What we are trying to do is take the corals into the tanks and then cycle the water. So we're going from a higher temperature to a lower temperature to a higher temperature. Why are we doing that? To build resilience. The reason why corals are dying is that their evolution cycle is not in keeping with how quickly the sea is increasing in temperature. But we can artificially induce that by making them resilient through giving them multiple cycles so that when we put them out into the reef, they'll be there, they'll be familiar with the highs and the lows, and therefore they will be able to survive in that environment. But in doing that, We also don't want to create what I would say is Scotland's problem is you can buy a forest and the trees are all in rows and lines and it just looks artificial. We have to be sympathetic to the natural environment. Why we don't want to induce new predators? And we want this to be somewhere where divers can go and can experience it. Or indeed, if you're looking at it through your digital twin, be that on a laptop or a headset, you get the same feeling that this is a natural and sympathetic environment. And at the end of it, we'll have trained people, lots of people, on how to restore coral reefs. So the Elevate students go in, they get to sample, how do we image the corals? How do we dive and put them down and cement them or glue them or attach them to the reef? They get to understand the parameters of the science behind it, and they get to become practitioners in the nurseries themselves. So we're creating that societal impact and that economic impact all in one, and we're protecting the coastlines. With algae, I think this is the best demonstration of how we can scale projects at KAUST using our infrastructure. And I said a little bit about it earlier, but we can produce 100 tons of dried protein mass per year from the facility we have on the campus today. That means that we can then experiment further as to which other strains can make different products in the future. But at the same time, we can then look at the impact of expressing oud. So Kyle Larson is working on a strain of algae that produces the fragrance of the oud tree. I didn't know until he told me that the oud tree is an endangered species. So if we can recreate oud smell, we can stop the deforestation of the oud tree, and everybody can still smell good when they go out every day. So we're working with a well-known fragrance company with Kyle to scale up that technology, not using the facility that we have here, but using internal photoreactors to allow us to grow it and to express the proteins and purify them. The vaccine center is the ugly grey building that everybody has seen on campus that is not finished. We hope to make it the finished building that everybody can see and no longer thinks it's an eyesore on the landscape. In order to do that, we're working with the Ministry of Industry, Mineral Resources, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Finance, and we're actually talking to some CDMO companies around operating it. What we want to do is to create the original vision for this facility. If there was a pandemic tomorrow, here as in the UK, we have a problem. We can't produce vaccines. So this centre would be a primary response to a pandemic, because the way that the building will be designed is that if we can get our hands on a vaccine that works, we will make lots of it and ship it out very quickly. When I was introduced, somebody kindly said that I was given the OBE. One of the reasons why I got the OBE was that the vaccine that became the AstraZeneca vaccine was in a clinical trial in Oxford. And we were in a bit of a race and a bit of a panic. And so I gave some money to start, which was the scale up. And then I gave some additional money and support to allow us to get it into the clinic. And then eventually I secured some manufacturing capability to make it at scale. And through doing that process, it made me realize that something as simple as the wrong virus impact in society can have devastating impact. Instead of coronavirus, if it had been the flu, you'd all have got a jab and you'd all been fine. But the fact that the biggest risk was coronavirus, that we hadn't thought would be the problem, gave us the real challenge of how do we create vaccines at scale and at pace. So I think this building will do three things. It gives us a resilient capability. Secondly, I talked about training people in the biotechnology and biomanufacturing industry. But thirdly, and more importantly, within the kingdom, we have a number of infectious diseases that are particular to the Middle East. So trying to create the next generation of vaccines and scale them up does two things. It confers protection, and it allows us to create an industry where we can export products. So one of the aims is to get good ideas in early into the clinic and hopefully into people's arms so that they can survive MERS, SARS, and whatever the next outbreak will be. Again, I'm going to go back to the Hippocratic Oath. If you can do no good, at least do minimal harm. So one of the things that we're doing working with Professor Roberts is to try and see if we can remove CO2 from the exhausts of power stations. So using a technique called cryogenic carbon capture, our aim is to tap into the flue gases, take them down, expose them to liquid nitrogen, freeze them, create the CO2, and then ship it off for usage. So the irony is that the atmosphere has too much CO2 in it, but there's a lack of industrial grade CO2 for commercial applications. The most common one is for food storage. So by taking this exhaust waste, cooling it down and purifying it, suddenly we're in a place where we can put it back into the system and use it meaningfully, whilst reducing the emissions and obviously the illnesses caused by that, as well as climate change. So simple things such as taking gases, cooling them down, separating them help us. But we can't do that in isolation. We need a power plant. So thankfully we work with Saudi Electric Company. We need government support. So we work with the Ministry of Energy. We also work with Aramco because that CO2 can also be translated into methanol and other products as well. So suddenly we're creating an industry around waste gases. In the same way, using algae and drying it down, we're creating an industry out of another form of waste, because waste streams have value. And I think that's the important thing we need to really focus on more. Changing tact a little bit. We also want to use the campus to look at the future of mobility. Why is it important? It's important because we're in a transition now where electric cars are becoming more popular. I was astonished to know that there is no proving ground for automotive vehicles in the kingdom. And when you think about the harshness of the climate, the amount of sand, the humidity, we take test data from tracks such as Spain and assume that cars in Saudi Arabia are going to operate effectively on it. A little known fact, Saudi service their plane engines more frequently than any other aircraft carrier in the world. Why? Because of the environment that they fly in. So why wouldn't you look at the same for your cars? So having this homologation ground for vehicles, I think, is vital. Secondly, as autonomous vehicles become more popular, the roles of sensors, sensing, materials, batteries, electronics, and compute become much more important. Having all those resources at KAUST, we can directly impact how Seer and Lucid and Hyundai can develop the next generation of cars, looking at lightweight of materials, looking at LiDAR sensors, looking at incorporating fluid dynamics so that we can make the noise less. So again, having that environment allows us to have a unique perspective on how we can shape the future of mobility in the kingdom. And then you take into the fact that we control our low-level airspace. So some of you, I'm sure, will have participated in the food drone delivery. We're actually going to work with more drone companies as well to try and eventually, hopefully, have a low-flying air taxi demonstrator on campus in between here and Cake to start to look at the next generation of technologies and how they might be utilized fully. And then finally, we're going to take advantage of the fact that we're next to the sea to look at the future of marine transport. Autonomous boats, electric boats, light-weighted boats, all of which can be used in a responsible way, being sympathetic to the environment, and can be developed with our great science here at KAUST. So all that's great. We've got great things going on, but we also realize in NTI, we have to be accelerating commercial impact. So how do we do that? We try and identify ideas that have the potential to be transformative. Again, I didn't realize that the physical properties of sand in the desert render it difficult to make building aggregates. Jorge has developed a technology that allows us to effectively make the sand rough and absorb carbon. So again, we're sequestering some carbon, but we're taking this effectively smooth desert sand that's been smoothed by the wind, making it rough. In doing that process, it then becomes a low-cost aggregate that allows us to make concrete and build from. Why is that important? Saudi Arabia imports hundreds of millions of tons of sand from Australia. So we can take that out of the footprint, our CO2 footprint. We don't have to bring it here. We can utilize sand. There's plenty of it, I'm led to believe. And at the same time, we can impact the giga projects. So Climate Creep was born out of that. And it's the first time that Capital K, which is the KAUST Scale-Up Fund, has worked with the KAUST Seed Fund to commit funding to a project. And I'm pleased to say Jorge's now got some commercial contracts with NEOM to deploy that technology. So it shows that we can take an idea built in KAUST, solve a kingdom problem, create jobs, and impact the giga projects at the same time. Again, that wouldn't be possible without all the partners that are mentioned on the screen. I'll leave hydrogen for the minute because I think I'm running out a bit of time. I'll go to Bill's technology, because one of the areas that we also are able to look at is the quality of fuels. So one of the dirtiest forms of fuels at the moment are marine fuels, tend to be high in sulfur. Using a similar technology to the cryogenic carbon capture, Bill can crystallize out the sulfur so we can reduce the emissions, make the fuel cleaner, make marine transport more efficient, and also make it less contaminating from the overspill effects of combustion. But again, if we weren't working with OSP and with Luberif, we can't scale these ideas up. So the importance of having the right commercial partners to demonstrate the technologies at scale is absolutely vital for us. And I would say the take-home message about NTI today is we don't stand in isolation. We work in partnership, both with faculty and with government and with companies. But one of the unique assets that we have at KAUST is Beacon Development. And Beacon Development look at this from a completely different way. It is the Kingdom's premier environmental consultancy, providing support for almost all of the giga projects that are around. Most of the work is undertaken in the field, supported by the campus and the campus activities. And we now have roughly 200 experts across a number of fields, from the environment to marine to wildlife, that work on a daily basis to ensure that the Kingdom's commitment to environmental protection is actually measured and tangible with real benefits. So we run kind of two things out of KBD. One is, I would say, the kind of services. So if you need to build a building in the Kingdom, you need to get a land use permit. To get a land use permit, you must complete what they call an environmental impact analysis form, or ANISA. All of that takes expertise to look at the land, to look at the geology, to look at the wildlife, and then compile a report as to how that all fits together. So we provide what we call services in the environmental management area. And then the other side is we scale projects for them. So we work with the algae, we work with aquaculture and fisheries, and CIRC, which is working with the DAMA to take your waste and turn it into compost. All of those projects either originated with or are still with KBD, who do deliver a premier service for the stakeholders in the Kingdom. And I think that's becoming more widely regarded as we go forward. A couple of projects that you might not have heard of is the Fisheries Management Plan. So there is a real emphasis on improving the diet in the Kingdom. And I think around the coast, there's plenty of people eating fish. When you get to Riyadh, the consumption of fish per head of population goes way down. So how do we get fresh fish to Riyadh? And how do we do that in a sustainable way for the environment? Well, we'll look at what the domestic supply of fish is. We try and get sympathetic breeding grounds to breed them up, and then we try and transport them in a sympathetic way to ensure that the dietary content is improving. We can only do that if we understand about the fish biology, that we understand which stocks are present to start with, and then how we can get to that sustainable level. One of the challenges in the UK, for example, is that our shores have been overfished, and therefore the degrees of native species has gone down dramatically in recent years. So we have to work in collaboration with the Coast Guards, with fisheries, with the ministries, and with the industry to ensure that we can create this holistic package to increase fish consumption whilst being sympathetic to the environment. We also have to tag the wildlife. So one of the interesting programs is to track the megafauna habitats around both the land and the sea. But I think KBD gets some great jobs. They get to track humpback dolphins, we get to tag turtles, they get to follow sharks and rays, and they get to count them and understand the behavioral patterns, and are they changing? And are they changing as the Red Sea temperature changes, or the pH changes, or the seasons change? So they're creating tools using drones, both in air and in the water, autonomous vehicles. They're using AI and digital tools so that they don't have to do this on a manual basis, but they're doing it remotely and they're doing it rapidly in support of all the efforts of the kingdom. And then we also measure wildlife, such as Ricardo's work that he's been doing for many years around the Royal Reserve. We had the benefit of trying to baseline the wildlife ecosystem to understand and identify new and endangered species in the kingdom. The last thing I want to talk about, I think, is partnerships. As I said right at the start, the take-home message here is that the NTI, in my view, others may differ, is a partnering organization. And one of the big changes that we made was to the KAUST Industry Collaborative Program. I'm paraphrasing, and probably Maz would be upset if he heard me say this, but what we used to do is we used to bring people to KAUST for the day. We used to tell them how great they were. We'd probably take them for a meal, maybe allow them to dive, and then suddenly we'd shake their hands and say, thanks very much. So when I took over the innovation portfolio, I said, so what advice does the industry collaboration program give us? And they went, no. So I said, okay, we're going to do things differently. We're going to take it to Riyadh. We're going to engage with government as part of our partners, because government are the biggest procurers of innovation. And we're going to try to understand what the problems and challenges are so that we can go back to them and pro-offer solutions. I didn't think it was such a controversial idea, but poor Maz and the KICP team, let's say, took a little bit of convincing. So I said, right, we'll run it as an experiment, and I bet you won't want to move it back. So at that point, we had, I think, 12 members-ish, and the meetings were quite one-directional. So fast forward 24 months or so, we've held, I think, 8 meetings in Riyadh. Average attendance of about 120 organizations. Our membership is up to 28, and we've created work streams across the 4 pillars of the RDIA strategy that form the basis of the Accelerating Impact strategy. Why has that changed so much? Because we're listening as well as communicating, and we're trying to understand what their problems are so that we can look at our toolbox and try and see how we can help to solve it. And I think it's been transformational in how KAUST is regarded within those organizations, and it's also opened up an awful lot of opportunities for us to exploit. So one example would be, what do we do with MEWA? So we had the Climate Change Centre here, that's been running for some time. We did build the algae and the aquaculture facilities, but we also launched the Saudi Agri-Food Technology Alliance, a membership organization for the agri-food community to come together to tell us what their problems are, to allow us to then go back and lobby MEWA on their behalf. So we now have 130 members in the space of 12 months. They've got 5 policy units. We've created 7 white papers, and suddenly that sector has a voice for what it needs to do to be a future-looking organization that has sympathy for the environment. We also have the International Water Research Centre going to be located at KAUST, and we also look at elements such as the future of mining. So with MEWA, we've got 29 ongoing projects. We've delivered another 7 successfully. We've raised almost 100 million SARS with the investment into the palms and dates sector, including looking at how we can combat the infestation with the red palm weevil. And we've used KAUST technologies through all of those activities to do it. So once we know the problem statements and once we understand the challenges, we can then look to the scientists and build the solutions that ultimately end up yielding value. And remember, the impact is not just economical, it's societal. The Native Genome Project, we've been heavily involved in sequencing over 300 native species over the past 3 years. National Centre for Palms and Dates, I didn't realize that the red palm weevil problem was such a big impact for the yield of dates. Having seen that, we've run 4 projects at a total value of $22 million, which will continue for another 3 years, really looking at how do we encourage excellence in sustainability whilst developing the premier food of the kingdom in terms of its overall net export value. As I said, with Pascal's technology, we're increasing the mobile wastewater technologies and trying to allow that to become 1,000 meters cubed per day. And we work with Aquapower on the campus to actively promote the latest desalination technologies, because we need to bring the costs of desalination down by at least tenfold from where it is today, around 50 cents to around 5 cents. So we expect to integrate more membrane technology within our plants over the next 5 years or so. The last thing I think I'll talk about, because I can see you all beginning to glaze over, is the Aramco-sponsored research centre. This centre was created in order to bring KAUST and Aramco closer together. And over the past 18 months or so, we now talk about the Aramco Super Centre. That's really been designed to galvanize the activities of KAUST and Aramco in energy into a field of 20 projects. So the aim is to spend $100 million over 10 years to create 15 or so projects that are deployable by Aramco that either increase their revenues or decrease their costs. In order to do that, we have a PI from the Aramco side and a PI from the KAUST side. KAUST have to get the technology to technology readiness level 6. So that's a prototype. And then Aramco PI then has to take it and deploy it within Aramco to impact the business needs. And we aim to have 15 hard tech technologies deployed and 5 soft tech or digital technologies deployed over the next 5 years or so. The difference here is that we measure everything that we do. It's all done through KPIs and traffic light monitoring system, and we can see our full breadth of activities across Aramco on a quarterly basis to ensure that we're meeting the needs both of Aramco and of KAUST. Fleet is another consortium that we're looking at, is to try and make efficient engine technologies. Of course, again, going back to trying to prevent harm, but this time we're then working with the likes of Ferrari, Toyota, as well as Aramco. Again, partnerships is the key theme here. As is the case with Enercomp, which is looking at composite materials to replace metallic pipes, for example, to allow us to have less risk of corrosion, make the materials easier to deploy, and more resilient for the future. So with that, I think I will stop and give you 10 or so minutes to ask me any questions. Thank you for listening, and thank you online, even if I wasn't addressing you directly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Dr. Ian. It's very inspiring to see the vast projects, different teams. Does anybody have any questions?
Thank you for the talk. First of all, you mentioned the 2 algae-related projects. One is the scaled up, and the other is the research lab with Professor Lewison. Yeah. So I was assuming 2 main factors, but I wonder if there's more that distinguishes them from each other. So other than maybe the aim or the product aim to produce and the scaled up and scaled down factors, is there anything else that makes you or makes KAUST go with one over the other in terms of collaborations?
No, again, did you hear the question? So the answer to that is that they solve different problems. So the problem statement for the external algae farm is how much dry protein can you make that we can turn into fish and animal feed. That's a problem of scale. With Professor Larsson's technology, the question is how much of the expressed material can we capture chemically? Because effectively what we're doing is we're purifying a chemical from the biology of the algae. So they require completely different technologies because they operate at different scales, even in industry. But we try to use different technologies depending on the needs. So one is more of a mass production and then you dry it down. The other one is more of a grow it and then purify. So depending on the needs in the product and whether the product's soluble or not, you'll need to use different processing techniques in order to create the product. And it's a question of which one is most fit for use.
Makes sense. Is there possibility of whatever is happening in the lab would be scaled up in the other project?
So the spirulina project started off in the tube bioreactor and then ended up in the raceways. With the production of perfumes, it's very unlikely you would do that because exposure to the environment, you'd likely get a breakdown of the product, so you wouldn't be able to purify it. But what we try and do there is effectively go from small bioreactors to bigger bioreactors. So the reason for the NTI intervention in Professor Larson's technology was to allow him to reach pre-commercial scale. So he had it working effectively on the bench, and we've moved it into something that's more like a pilot plant.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Nobody from NTI can ask a question. No, I'm kidding.
So my question, you mentioned there's a localized benefit in the KCRI projects.
Yep.
Do you see there being a benefit or opportunities to take that knowledge, that data on a global scale? I'm thinking about reefs in Australia, for example. Do you think that's a KAUST opportunity, or does it stay within Kingdom?
Okay, so when I talked at the start, I said that the reason for doing coral restoration at scale is because if universities don't do it, nobody will do it, because at the moment, there's no commercial outlet for corals in this technology. Let's be realistic. If 90% of the corals are going to disappear by 2050, we're going to have lots of low-lying countries that are going to be flooded. So where I see it is that we can develop solutions that appear expensive today. Our learnings will turn iterations into that to make that cost effective, and then we'll have solutions that can be deployed. So immediately, I think that the digital assets will be deployable and the way in which we're doing them. I think some of the creativeness around how we're doing the sexual reproduction of coral will be easily replicable. What you can't do is export corals, because you don't want to export a native species into a non-native area, because that could end up introducing predators. But the underlying principles of how we're scaling it, so the designs of the nursery, how we use our boat and our diving operations, how we use autonomous vehicles to monitor it, all of that could be monetized stroke commercialized in some way going forward. But I think if it wasn't for a university taking the lead to do that from an empirical science basis, none of those technologies would be scalable. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh,
Lujaina Sharif was wondering, she has an interest in sustainable technologies and how it affects the market. Other than the ones that you have discussed, what resources can you share to learn more about this topic?
oh, that's a good question. So I think I would start by looking at where KAUST has come from over the last 5 years. And I think there is a theme, and it has been, where are we creating waste streams, and then how can we avoid making those waste streams, and then how do you turn them into value? So I can think of areas in water and water reuse. I can think of areas in chicken waste that can then be turned into biochar, which can then be turned into sustainable soil for the Saudi Green Initiative. So I think where you can see a waste stream, how you can then create products from it, or if you take the other side, where there is waste being created, how can we capture it and reuse it? So the cryogenic carbon capture. So I think there's a lot in the environmental science already in the KAUST website, but I would go to the UN, look at the Sustainable Development Goals and the activities around that. Look at something like the Earthshot Prize, where you can see technologies that have great ambition that are going to be scaled. No questions. Now on you go.
I just want to ask you, what will be your bet for the first KAUST unicorn?
Oh.
Not sustainable related. Just
So, well, I like to bust myths, right? So let's think about unicorns that have been created in the last few years, right? Let's start with Microsoft. It didn't come out of university, it came out of people that dropped out of university. Facebook came out of somebody dropping out of university. So there is no formula that says a university creates unicorns. Good ideas that solve problems create unicorns. And I think if the pursuit of the KAUST innovation ecosystem is to create unicorns, we might get lucky, right? The more shots on goal, the more chance we might get lucky. Gary Player, very famous golfer, once said, the more he practiced, the luckier he got, right? So in order to create a unicorn, what do you need? You need to solve a problem. You need to have a unique perspective in a landscape that can adopt it quickly, that can deploy it at scale, right? Our biggest challenge at the moment in the kingdom is our innovation ecosystem spends 0.8% of GDP in R&D. The OECD average is 2.7, right? And then you look at the absorptive capacity. So how many companies, how many R&D tech companies do we actually have that are doing that at scale at the moment? And the answer is not enough, right? So do I think a unicorn will come from KAUST? Yes. Do I think it will be in the next 5 years? Possibly not, right? But I think we don't need to worry about unicorns. I think there's a hurdle we have to overcome before that. And I'm probably going to say something that's quite controversial. If I had come to KAUST in 2016, a number of the spin-outs that were created, if I was responsible for them, I wouldn't have started them. Why? They were started too early, on too little IP, with too little know-how, with the PIs as the CEOs. If you look at MIT's model is, PI, you've been great. You've created a startup. There's 10% of the equity. Go back into your lab, create more value, and we'll run this as a business. And we need to run our startups as businesses, not as sidelines for the research that's being done. So we need a different approach. We also need more private capital coming in, and we actually need our companies to leave the campus. And that's the biggest struggle we've got, is they like it at KAUST. And so what we're trying to do with the Riyadh office is give them a bridgehead into Riyadh. Why is it important? The market, the customers, the funding, the working capital, the human resources, the regulators, the governments, the markets. So for KAUST to create a unicorn, we need to seed them here and scale them elsewhere, is my honest answer. Does that mean that we shouldn't stop trying? No, it doesn't. And where I would see success for, let's say me, if I was looking at my legacy in 5 years, a horrible word. If we had a couple of companies that employed 200 to 250 people and were doing really well, I'd say we've done our bit. We already have over 6,000 people working today in jobs that were created through being enrolled in KAUST programs or with KAUST startups. Let's say we can double that to 12,000 by 2030. What does that mean? Well, let's take the figure, $550,000 a salary. So suddenly we're going up to 60 million benefit to the kingdom. It's all incremental. If I wanted to create a unicorn, I'd go to either Shenzhen or Silicon Valley. Why? I can get access to people that have done it before. I can get access to finance, and people will accept if I fail and I'll try again. And we need to get that mentality around entrepreneurism is not linear, and therefore we need to diversify our approach to achieving it. And also, even if the technology arrives in KAUST, what would you rather have? A technology that solves a problem that goes into a Dow or a Lucid or a Seer and creates $1 billion in value, or a technology that's developed in KAUST and they create tens of handfuls of sales? I would rather go with the route to the market. Hope that answers your question.
Okay, this question is to both Ian and Anna. Our MTI projects have a heavy component in sustainability. Every time we prepare a presentation to or a pitch to the ministries, there's always a slide on the benefits on applying or implementing these projects and technologies. My question is, how MTI and sustainability department are collaborating in these projects, or if there is any idea or any objective in common that we could collaborate in the future.
You can go first. Yeah.
So from the Office of Sustainability, the perspective that we are enablers, meaning that we work across the university. Just the first, I would say, step from my answer. We've been collaborating in multiple forms. Well, there is actually not a process. We do it organically because we believe that I think there's value for our interaction. Could be going to Riyadh and supporting the collaboration partnerships. Could be supporting beacon development. Could be having brainstorming sessions about potential ideas. Now, can we do better? Perhaps we can. We need to think about it, what we can help and capitalize more on bringing perhaps a different perspective to the existing projects. I think there's always value to bring more heads to the discussion. Sometimes, let's be also realistic. Life doesn't allow this because we are just a few people. But I would say that we have a very good common ground in a lot of things. And one of them is just why Ian is here, because we see the value of a lot of the things NTI is doing in sustainability. Although we don't have the full room, I say to Ian, this is recorded. Our students are going to watch it. And I'm sure they will add value. There are more things coming over from them. But yeah, long answer, but I want to hear from you.
So I think I said at the start that I think if we don't have sustainability at the heart of what we're doing from a future-looking perspective, we wouldn't be able to achieve it, because I think more and more there's a realism that society has to be more responsible with the environment and the resources at our disposal. So I think that goes without saying. I think we are going to create some Saudi dresswear out of seaweed with the Ministry of Culture. Anna was involved at the start of that project. So we can already see how we can work together. It's more important that we tell the story of what we're doing. Because I think it's very easy to get caught in the technologies and the outcomes and not realize that at the heart of what we're trying to do is to benefit the environment, society, and the economy. And I think by having a diverse portfolio, it allows us, when we're reporting back on our SDGs, to actually say, here are the actions and the mitigations that we look forward to introducing over time. But in terms of formalizing a partnership, I think the partnerships need to evolve and they need to have a free spirit. That's why as a university we thrive, because we don't constrain thinking and ideas, and we try and find formulas that work over time.
I have a question.
Go for it.
First of all, I would like to thank you because I'm aware about some of the project here, but when I see all of them on the same slides in one presentation, I say, wow, we are doing amazing here at KAUST, and what we can do more to contribute to the kingdom vision. I wanted to ask, for example, with all these projects and initiatives, how you can see the role of NTI to contribute to the carbon market in the kingdom. Especially last seminar was led by a student for sustainability, and we invite a speaker from voluntary carbon market company that's overseen by BIF and Tadawul. How we can contribute, or NTI can contribute to the carbon market in the kingdom?
That's a good question. So we are going to undertake a project with the governor of Taif, and we are going to look at how we can introduce carbon credits to some of their activities through the R&D that we're doing to scale some of the productive crops that they have on their list. Trying to think of the ones that they have. Coffee was one, but we're trying to look at how that can be measured. You can't do that with corals because corals are animals, so therefore they respire, so they give off CO2. So the carbon market, I think we need to be careful, because I'd rather we concentrated on delivering tangible benefits than offsetting with intangible ones. So a lot of the projects that we covered today, you can see a clear benefit in carbon capture. I think if we started to look at the ways how we just use carbon credits as a way of offsetting our activity, if everybody did that, then we're just pushing the can down the road. So from my point of view, yeah, carbon credits are going to be important, and it's one asset of what we're doing. But I think our responsibility is to try and look at also how we can use technologies in different ways to minimize our use of carbon or increase the absorption of carbon.
As you know, because we are working on our climate action plan, and maybe this is something between sustainability office with them.
So I can employ 40 people to run the algae farm 24/7 and produce hundreds of tons of dry protein, right? Who's going to pay for them? If nobody buys the protein mass at the end, I've absorbed a lot of CO2, I've done great, but I've done it all on cost. So we could great carbon credits, but I've still had to employ people to do it. If I have a customer for that product, they can pay for the 50 people, and I don't need to apply for the carbon credits. So I think we've got to be very clear that we could use our assets differently to achieve certain outcomes, but that comes at the detriment of something else. So I think what we're trying to do is realize the benefit, create the impact, improve society, and create jobs.
So much.
Thank you all. I think time's up. Thank you so much, Dr. Ian, for coming today and giving us this talk. And thank you all for coming. Please keep an eye on our next seminar. If you're not in the WhatsApp group or you're not receiving our emails, let me know and I will add you. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you all.